case, but it was too late for them to find any new forensic evidence. When the Speedway police had arrived at the burger chef the night before, they didn't dust for fingerprints, calling crime scene investigation technicians. Then, the next morning, the cops let employees clean the crime scene and open the restaurant. While police protocol has come a long way since then, even in 1978, this was not proper protocol. Later, the officers handling the case returned to the restaurant and set the crime scene back up as best they could and took photos. They didn't immediately tell the lead investigators that the pictures they handed in were taken after the crime scene had been dismantled, cleaned, and restaged from memory. Officer Buddy Ellwanger, who worked on the case, would later admit, quote, "We screwed it up from the beginning." By the time the FBI arrived, the town was in all-out panic. Search parties fanned out on foot, helicopters soared overhead. Everyone hoped they were still looking for kidnappers and living victims and not dead bodies. Those hopes were soon dashed. Saturday dragged on without any sightings. Then, on Sunday afternoon, November 19th, some hikers made a horrific discovery in the woods, about a half-hour's drive south from the restaurant. They saw Ruth's and Daniel's bodies lying near a trail and called the police. When detectives arrived, they soon located Jane and Mark's bodies too. The investigators were able to determine that 17-year-old Ruth and 16-year-old Daniel were shot with a .38 caliber handgun. Their bodies were found close together, and the bullets that killed them came from the same gun. About 30 or 40 yards away, 20-year-old Jane had been stabbed to death with a hunting knife. So badly that the 4.5-inch blade broke off and was left. Was never found. Mark came closest to escaping. He was the tallest of the group, striding alone that made him the fastest runner, but about 150 feet from Jane's body, he died of asphyxiation. Yet there was no sign he was strangled, although there was evidence he had been severely beaten. The police theorized that Mark managed to get free and ran into the dark woods and he collided with a tree. Then they found he fell backwards, likely unconscious, and choked to death on his own blood from the injuries he sustained from the collision. Mark's body became another piece of perplexing evidence in a case that seemed to make no sense. Why would a small-time crook murder 4 people? How did the robber or robbers force 4 strong, smart young people to leave the restaurant with them, seemingly without a struggle? And where was the killer now? Missing Burger Chef employees were found murdered on November 18, 1978. Police had very little evidence to go on. Still, detectives had a sinking suspicion that this wasn't the killer's first high-profile crime. Because even before these 4 horrific murders, 1978 was by far the scariest year anyone in Speedway, Indiana could remember. It started about 4 months earlier, on July 29th, with the killing of 65-year-old Julia Cyphers. She was a grandmother, a Girl Scout troop leader, and a loyal wife. Not exactly the type of person to have violent enemies. And yet, someone had killed her in cold blood. A man Julia didn't know had visited a garage sale she held some weeks earlier. Then he made an appointment to return and look at some unsold items. He missed that appointment and showed up unexpectedly at her door on a different day. Julia agreed to go into the garage with him and show him the items. As soon as they were alone, the stranger shot Julia dead, jumped into his vehicle, and fled the scene. Speedway police suspected the murder was a professional job. The killer planned his crime for weeks and didn't steal anything. He openly showed his face to the victim and her husband. Then he executed the crime quickly and efficiently, followed by an equally quick and efficient escape. Impossible as it might seem, there may have been a hitman in Speedway, and for some reason, he killed Julia Cyphers. But before the cops could get their hands around one unprecedented case, another one arose. On September 1st, 1978, bombs exploded at 3 different locations in town. One of them went off across the street from the Speedway Burger Chef, not long after Jane Frey transferred to that location. Nobody was hurt, and 2 of the 3 bombs were deposited in trash containers, so police hoped they were just dealing with a prankster. That's until the 4th bomb went off the very next day, followed by the 5th and the 6th. On September 3rd, the 7th bomb exploded outside a local bowling alley. Then on September 5th, the bomber blew up a police cruiser. The final bomb, detonated on September 6, 1978, was the only one to hurt a human being. It was concealed in a gym bag in the parking lot of Speedway High School, where Mark Fleming studied and played in the band. As a football game was letting out, 39-year-old Carl DeLong, a Vietnam veteran with a son on the football team, spotted the gym bag. He thought one of the players must have forgotten it. The bomb inside was on a timer. It went off as Carl was bending over to pick the bag up. He lost his right leg in the explosion. As the tragedies compounded, police didn't know if they were looking for one person or 2. It was possible that the hitman and the terrorist were the same person, but detectives couldn't be sure. While police were busy searching for answers, the people of Speedway were grappling with a harsh reality. It wasn't safe in their city. A local businessman, Brett Kimberlin, was identified as a person of interest in the killing of grandmother Julia Cyphers. He had a grudge against Julia, who suspected he had an inappropriate relationship with one of her grandchildren. She would have recognized him, though, so he wasn't the gunman, but he might have hired someone to kill her. Brett Kimberlin soon became a suspect in the bombings, too. At least one person told detectives that he had bought bomb parts from them. Traces of explosives were found in Kimberlin's car, along with the same kind of timers used in the bombs. Police were confident Kimberlin was guilty, although it wasn't enough evidence to arrest him. But the longer they looked into him, the more potential crimes came to light. They came to believe that he was selling marijuana out of his natural food store and that he had connections to drug cartels. Based on all this, when Jane, Ruth, Daniel, and Mark were found murdered, some detectives immediately thought of Brett Kimberlin. He was the closest thing Speedway had to a mob boss. Even if he didn't pull the trigger himself, he could have hired someone to do it, like they believed he had with Julia Cyphers. But why would Kimberlin want to kill 4 young Burger Chef employees? He didn't need the $500 or so missing from the cash registers. Detectives wondered if the murders were a last-minute change of plans. Maybe it was meant to be just a robbery, but something went wrong. But nailing down forensic evidence proved difficult. especially because after the bodies were found, the investigators once again inadvertently contaminated the crime scene. As officers arrived, they drove through areas that should have been preserved. They may have even moved at least one of the bodies. So, as Sunday the 19th drew to a close, the police had 4 bodies, almost no physical evidence, and no strong leads, although they did have some theories. They believed Brett Kimberlin was capable of murder, but they weren't sure if he was unhinged enough to kill 4 people while already under investigation for murder and terrorism. They wondered if the young man who called out of work Friday night was involved. Why did he show up at the Burger Chef just after midnight? Was he returning to the scene of the crime? Through the FBI, yet another possibility surfaced. 3 inmates had escaped from an Ohio prison on the day of the robbery and murders. They'd taken hostages before. It was possible they made it all the way to Indiana, kidnapped the Burger Chef crew, then killed them when they tried to escape. But there was a final theory that made the most sense to some of the detectives working the case. There had been a string of fast food robberies in the Indianapolis area, including one at another Burger Chef franchise. Those robbers had never hurt anyone before, but they might if they were facing arrest. Maybe one or more of the kids on the closing shift recognized someone among the robbers, and all 4 employees were killed as a result. Like all the other theories, it certainly seemed viable, but there was no proof. If the cops wanted to pin charges on any of their suspects, they'd need hard evidence, or at least a confession. Eventually, they would get a confession, but instead of solving their case, it was about to derail it, and an already mind-boggling investigation was about to get that much more difficult to solve. Thanks so much for listening. I'm Carter Roy, and this is Murder True Crime Stories. Come back next week for part 2 of our series on the Burger Chef murders. Murder True Crime Stories is a Crime House original. Here at Crime House, we want to thank each and every one of you for your support. If you like what you heard today, reach out on social media at Crime House on TikTok and Instagram. Don't forget to rate, review, and follow Murder True Crime Stories wherever you get your podcasts. And to enhance your listening experience, subscribe to Crime House Plus on Apple Podcasts. You'll get every episode of Murder True Crime Stories ad-free, along with early access to each thrilling 2-part series and exciting bonus content. We'll be back next Tuesday. Murder True Crime Stories, a Crime House original, is executive produced by Max Cutler. This episode of Murder True Crime Stories was produced and directed by Ron Shapiro. Sound designed by Carrie Murphy. Written by Yelena War. Edited by Alex Benedon. Fact-checked by Claire Cronin. And included production assistance from Sarah Carroll. Murder True Crime Stories is hosted by Carter Roy. Want to stay grounded amidst the chaos of life? Introducing Mantra with Gemma. The end of the investigation, right? Sure, we've all heard of coerced confessions, but if someone the police weren't even looking into calls them up and says, "I did it," then that person can also lead detectives to new evidence, and he knows details of the crime scene that were never made public. Most of us would say, case closed. Someone exactly like that confessed to the Burger Chef murders, but then they retracted it. And because there was no physical evidence to go on, no charges were ever filed. To this day, the case remains officially unsolved, which leads us to ask the questions, was this person the real killer? Or did investigators fall for a false jailhouse confession coming from a convicted felon looking for a favor?
people's lives are like a story. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. But you don't always know which part you're on. Sometimes the final chapter arrives too soon. You don't always get to know the real ending. I'm Carter Roy, and this is Murder True Crime Stories, a Crime House original. Every Tuesday, I'll explore the story of a notorious murder or murders. I'll be bringing awareness to stories that need to be heard, with a focus on those who are impacted. At Crime House, we want to express our gratitude to you, our community, for making this possible. Please support us by rating, reviewing, and following Murder True Crime Stories wherever you get your podcasts. And to enhance your Murder True Crime Stories listening experience, subscribe to Crime House Plus on Apple Podcasts. You'll get every episode ad-free, and instead of having to wait for each episode of a two-part series, you'll get access to both at once, plus exciting bonus content. This is the second of 2 episodes on the Burger Chef murders, a baffling quadruple homicide in Speedway, Indiana, that's been unsolved for nearly half a century. In part 1, you heard how 4 young fast food workers went missing during their closing shift, launching a massive search effort.
That search ended with the gruesome discovery of all 4 bodies near a hiking trail in the woods. Today, in part 2, I'll take you through the investigation, which continues to this day. I'll tell you how a red herring suspect might have helped the real killer escape, and why a broken knife might still lead to the truth. Finally, I'll introduce you to a pair of detectives who both believe they've solved this case, but have different suspects in mind. All that and more coming up. Hey, it's Carter Roy, and if you love murder, true crime, chaos, and search, come on out onto Thursday night. Affordance of Speedway, Indiana, and the Texas Ice Storm. Today, people often joke about living through simultaneous apocalypses. Take the California wildfires that burned over 4 million acres in 2020 and the Texas ice storm that ravaged the state the following year. With disasters seemingly popping up around every corner, it can feel like the world is literally ending. It's a sentiment the residents of Speedway, Indiana would have understood as they looked at the front page of the Indianapolis Star on Monday, November 20th, 1978. The top story was about the Burger Chef murders, with the headline, 4 Speedway kidnapped victims found dead in wooded area. The second biggest story of the day was about the mass murder-suicide of cult members at the Jonestown Summit in Guyana. After a summer marked by the brutal murder of a local grandmother in her own garage, and a string of bizarre bombings that disfigured a Vietnam veteran, it must have felt like Speedway and the world itself was collapsing into chaos. Investigators hoped they'd get a quick break in the Burger Chef case and restore a sense of order to the town, but their hope was short-lived. As soon as they realized the most important clues in the case had probably already been destroyed. The 4 young victims, Ruth Ellen Shelton, Daniel Davis, Jane Freight, and Mark Flemons, were kidnapped and violently killed over what seemed like a simple robbery gone wrong. Only $581 was missing from the safe and cash registers of the Speedway Burger Chef. Because it initially looked like a petty crime, the responding officers allowed the restaurant to be cleaned and reopened for business without collecting forensic evidence. They didn't even take photos of the crime scene. Then, once the victims' bodies were discovered, police accidentally contaminated the second crime scene. Given all that, the police started their investigation at a significant disadvantage. But what they lacked in evidence, they made up for in manpower. Not only was the FBI called in, so were the Indiana State Police, the Indianapolis Police Department, and the Marion County Sheriff's Department. The latter was considered to be the premier investigative agency in the Indianapolis area at the time. As every elite detective in the region converged on Speedway, investigators wondered if all three of the year's most shocking crimes might be related. The Burger Chef murders, the killing of 65-year-old Julia Cyphers by a professional hitman, and the string of bombings that created chaos and fear in Speedway. And they had a suspect in the second two crimes, Brett Kimberlin, 24-year-old businessman. By day, he operated two natural foods businesses, but local and federal authorities believed he made most of his money by selling cannabis. Police believed Kimberlin had hired a hitman to kill Julia Cyphers because she suspected him of an inappropriate relationship with her grandchild. They theorized that the bombings were an attempt by Kimberlin to distract local authorities from the Cyphers case. And at least one store employee identified Kimberlin as the man buying items used to make the bombs. However, he didn't seem to have any motive for the Burger Chef murders, and his alibi that night checked out. Ultimately, Kimberlin was convicted of perpetrating the Speedway bombings. As for Julia Cyphers, she sadly never got justice. Detectives believe they identified the hitman who shot her, but the only eyewitness, Julia's husband, died before the suspect could be brought to trial. So if Kimberlin really was behind her death, we'll probably never know for sure. In the Burger Chef case, though, it was back to the drawing board. And one of the most determined people there was 35-year-old Virgil Vandegrift of the Marion County Sheriff's Department. Rather than sticking to tried and true strategies, Virgil made a point of studying up on new investigative techniques. He hoped to bring some of his cutting-edge knowledge to the table in Speedway. Virgil was tasked with following up on leads from the public, of which there were plenty thanks to two separate cash rewards. The Burger Chef Corporation put up $25,000 for information leading to an arrest in the case. Another anonymous donor offered an additional $10,000. Everyone in Indiana seemed to have a theory. Suspicion briefly fell on Jane Freight's on-again, off-again boyfriend, who some of her friends described as jealous. Investigators also looked into the unnamed Burger Chef employee who had called off work that night, but then inexplicably showed up at the restaurant right after the murders. In the end, though, neither of those leads panned out. Then the authorities got a series of calls that made Virgil sit up and pay attention. Two witnesses said they were behind the Burger Chef restaurant around the time of the kidnapping. They were approached by two men. One was bearded and another was clean-shaven. It struck the witnesses as strange because the two men asked the witnesses for identification, even though they didn't appear to be police officers. When the witnesses refused, the men told them to leave because there had been some vandalism. By itself, this wouldn't have been a huge break in the case, but the authorities interviewed three other witnesses who saw two men matching the same description near the restaurant that night. They were sitting in a dirty white or tan station wagon. Speedway police confirmed whoever they were definitely didn't work for the department. Then another separate witness came forward with an even more chilling story. The witness, who isn't linked to FBI files, told the authorities that on the night of the murders, he was somewhere between the restaurant and the woods where the bodies were found. Around 1 a.m., the witness was approached by a dark blue Plymouth car carrying two men and three women. The driver asked for directions to Stone's Crossing, an independent area of Johnson County near where the bodies were found. Investigators believe this witness was telling the truth. His description of the driver matched the other witness's description of the bearded man they'd seen, and it was possible the other passengers were some of the Burger Chef victims. This was the perfect opportunity to
generally considered an unreliable source of testimony in trials. But when information from a hypnotized witness can be confirmed by other evidence, the technique has proven useful. And back in the days before DNA testing, detectives needed whatever help they could get in a case like the Burger Chef murders. So the authorities hypnotized the witness. In a trance state, the teenager was able to describe a female passenger in the vehicle. His description matched one of the victims. Virgil wondered if this witness had encountered the killer. And there were 5 other people who could back up their description of the bearded man. Sketches of the bearded man and the clean-shaven man were quickly produced and distributed by local media, along with clay sculptures made of their heads. Soon enough, Virgil received a report that a man on the west side of town had been heard bragging in 2 local bars about committing the Burger Chef murders. But Virgil didn't want to risk bringing this guy in for questioning and getting stonewalled. Instead, he decided to go undercover. Pretty soon, he got himself into a game of pool with the possible suspect. It didn't take long for Virgil to lead his new pool buddy to the topic of the killings. The strategy seemed to pay off. Not only did he brag about the murders, he even broke his own pool cue in half to show how he treated the victims. That's when Virgil flashed his badge and took the man downtown, at which point his story changed. Once he was in a police interview room, the pool player swore he had nothing to do with the crime. He passed a polygraph test. Today, polygraphs aren't considered to be reliable, but back in the 1970s, they were a standard part of criminal investigations, and no physical evidence emerged linking this suspect to the murders. Virgil was back to square one. 4 bodies, no significant forensic evidence, and no credible suspects. 1978 was coming to an end, and the Burger Chef case wasn't any closer to being solved. Detectives reminded themselves it had only been a couple of months since the murders. A break in the case might be just around the corner, but no matter how close they felt they were to an answer, it would never come. Hey, it's Carter Roy here, and if you love murder true crime stories, then School Active Journal your true potential.
Jake,
Open mind or
man, just everything. Unseen. The true story of one man
6 weeks after the burger.
that leaves no one innocent. Coming February 2nd.
As 1978 drew to a close, about 6 weeks after the Burger Chef murders, Virgil Vandergriff of the Marion County Sheriff's Department was more determined than ever to find the killer. Having found forensic hypnosis helpful, he ventured even farther into the realm of the unseen, meeting with psychics and even a self-proclaimed medium who tried to contact the victims with a Ouija board. That was a step too far, though, even for Virgil.
I thought I was gonna
He left
sneeze.
the room without sticking around to
Dude.
see what the ghosts had to say.
It's all over my arm.
While Virgil was towing a
And my
line
shirt.
between science and spirituality, one of his colleagues with the Indiana State Police was following a more old-fashioned method, a hunch. Detective Ken York believed it was worth looking into rumors about a local fast food robbery gang. So Ken and some of his colleagues drove to nearby Franklin, Indiana in search of the robbers. It wasn't long before they spotted a bearded man who matched the previous police sketches. Living next door to him was another potential suspect, the police called the fair-haired man. These 2 were connected to a 3rd suspect, aptly nicknamed the Shotgun Man, because he would eventually be imprisoned for shotgun-related crimes. All 3 men had an alleged connection to fast food robberies, and 2 of them matched eyewitness descriptions of people seen near the Speedway Burger Chef on the night of the murders. The Indiana State Police got so excited, the police commissioner issued a temporary gag order
barring officers working the case from speaking to reporters. The authorities didn't want to risk showing their hand too early, potentially scaring their suspects into disappearing or destroying evidence. After doing some more digging, detectives learned that the bearded man didn't have an alibi for the night of the murders, so detectives decided to include him in a police lineup. They wanted to see if the eyewitnesses recognized him, but the bearded man was one step ahead of them. Before he could be called in, he shaved. If you've ever had a friend with facial hair suddenly go barefaced, you know how big of a difference it can be. The lineup plan was a bust. No charges in the Burger Chef murders were ever filed against any of the three men. The fair-haired man did, however, eventually go to prison for unrelated fast food robberies. After the investigation into the fast food robbery ring went nowhere, police shifted their focus towards another group of lawbreakers, local drug dealers. Surprisingly, that trail led to someone detectives already knew, not as a suspect, but as a bereaved family member. On March 5th, 1981, James Freight, the brother of victim Jane Freight, was arrested on cocaine-related charges. It made the police wonder, what if James had enemies, and they wanted to target Jane as a way of getting to him? Maybe the killers thought she'd be closing the restaurant alone that night, and panicked when they found 4 people inside. It was a promising theory, but a few weeks after James's arrest, the state police announced they didn't believe James was connected to his sister's murder. Once again, there just wasn't any evidence to back up their hunch. Sadly, the next big event related to the case also involved a victim's sibling. This time it was Kevin Flemons, one of Mark's brothers. Despite the Flemons' devotion to their Jehovah's Witness faith, it seemed Kevin had fallen in with a bad crowd. On December 28, 1981, Kevin and another man robbed an Indianapolis grocery store at gunpoint. The sawed-off shotgun Kevin used in the robbery was later found to be the murder weapon in a drug-related homicide. Kevin ended up pleading guilty to his role in the killing and served time in prison. However, there was no evidence connecting him to his brother's murder. The fact that 2 of the victims had siblings involved with drugs was just an odd coincidence. Despite the lack of progress, detectives, sheriff's deputies, state troopers, and FBI agents across Indiana remained obsessed with the Burger Chef murders. All of them dreamed of finding a clue that finally broke the case wide open. They put countless man-hours into it, but so far, nothing had come of their work. There were other murders to solve, other victims waiting for justice. So, much to the dismay of the many law enforcement officers who poured blood, sweat, and tears into the investigation, in 1983, the FBI recommended the case be administratively closed. And that's how it stayed, until a brand new detective entered the picture, bringing with him a brand new suspect. And this one was willing to confess. In 1984, Mel Wilsey was a detective and 16-year veteran of the Marion County Sheriff's Department. He joined the force as a fresh-faced 18-year-old, eager to make his name. Now, at 34, he was one of the few detectives in Indiana who hadn't ever been assigned to the Burger Chef case. That was about to change. In November 1984, 6 years after the Burger Chef murders, Mel received a tip from an Indianapolis Star reporter. A man incarcerated at the Pendleton Correctional Facility wanted to speak to someone about those 4 kids who got killed in Speedway back in 1978. More specifically, he wanted to confess to killing them. After spending his whole adult life chasing criminals, Mel was immediately wary, especially after finding out who the inmate was and
what he had to gain by confessing. 34-year-old Donald Wayne Forrester was just starting a 95-year sentence for 1979 sexual assault and kidnapping. During the crime, he repeatedly assaulted a young woman at gunpoint in the backseat of his car while an accomplice drove. The woman was terrified Forrester was going to shoot her, so she leaped from the moving car and ran to a nearby house for help. Now, 2 years later, Forrester was the one asking for help. He was scheduled for a transfer to the state prison in Michigan City, Indiana. As a sex offender, Forrester feared for his life at the state pen, where his crimes would be severely looked down upon. In exchange for a confession in the Burger Chef murders, he wanted to stay out of Michigan City. Mel Wilsey initially thought this was just another red herring. Forrester had plenty of time while awaiting his trial to read up on the Burger Chef murders. He knew how eager investigators were to solve this particular case, and that they'd be willing to do him a favor if he could help them solve it. So Mel moved slowly. First, he investigated Forrester's past to confirm if it was even possible that he was the killer. That part of the story checked out. Forrester was living in Speedway at the time, having just gotten out of prison for another sex crime. Next, Mel wanted to see if Forrester knew anything about the case that he couldn't have read in the papers. Detectives applied for a court order to bring Forrester to Marion County Jail in downtown Indianapolis. The order was approved, and Mel spent more than 2 years working with Forrester to obtain hard evidence. The more Mel talked to his new suspect, the more legitimate his story seemed. Here's what Donald Forrester told Mel about the night of November 17th, 1978. James Freight, Jane's brother, who was arrested for selling cocaine, owed money to a local gang of drug dealers. Forrester was one of them. That Friday night, Forrester and 3 of his associates broke into the Speedway Burger Chef. Their plan was to threaten 20-year-old Jane. They hoped she'd be scared enough to put the pressure on her brother to pay up. But 16-year-old Mark Flemings, who was already well over 6 feet tall and studied karate, had made Jane a promise that summer. After a string of fast food robberies nearby, he told Jane he'd protect her if anything ever happened at Burger Chef. According to Forrester, Mark kept his word. The fight took Mark and the drug dealers back out of the restaurant towards the gang's van.
Oh,
As
on
they
the steps.
continued to scuffle, Mark's head struck the bumper of the van and he collapsed. The dealers believed they'd killed him in full view of his 3 co-workers, Jane, Ruth, and Daniel. They'd signed up to scare a young 20-year-old woman, not to do time for murder. The criminals panicked and forced all 4 Burger Chef employees into their van. They thought Mark was already dead and planned to dump his body. The dealers didn't want to leave any witnesses, so they planned to kill the other 3 employees there too. The story sounded plausible, but Mel still needed hard evidence. So he asked Forrester to show him where they had killed the kids. He took Mel directly to the crime scene. There, Forrester pointed out exactly where each of the bodies had fallen. He was even able to describe their positions. In preparation for this trip, Mel had reviewed detailed photos of the crime scene, which most likely weren't available to the public. Forrester's description matched them perfectly. Mel was starting to believe he really had the killer in his grasp. Still, Forrester's disturbing level of knowledge of the crime scene wasn't enough to seal the deal. He could have gotten that information out of someone else during his time in prison. Maybe the real killer, or a police officer with loose lips. However, Forrester said he out to the .38 caliber shell casings he disposed of after shooting Daniel. That might be just enough to file charges. Mel spoke to Forrester's ex-wife.
What?
Incredibly, she confirmed that Forrester had
Yes.
taken her to the crime scene a few days after the bodies were removed. She remembered him picking up
I
some
know.
shell casings there, which he brought home and flushed down the toilet. That toilet, which had since been sold along with the Forrester's old house to a new owner, happened to be connected to a septic tank rather than a city sewer. Shocking even themselves, the detectives found the casings. They appeared to match the bullets found in Ruth and Daniel's bodies. After years of hard work, police finally had their first real piece of physical evidence. It still wasn't enough, because the gun used to kill Ruth and Daniel was still missing. If the shell casings were somehow a coincidence, maybe flushed by somebody else, charging Forrester could mean letting the real killer go free. So, in late 1986, Mel and his team prepared for another round of interviews with Forrester. Maybe he could tell them something more definitive about the other men who were there that night. A corroborating witness would go a long way towards proving his story. Then, the unthinkable happened. A police source leaked Forrester's confession to the press, and he suddenly clammed up, claiming his entire confession was coerced. On December 22nd, 1986, authorities announced that no charges would be filed against Forrester. Mel's department shipped him off to Michigan City State Prison. Once again, the investigation was closed. Since that devastating blow, there's been little progress made in the case. Over the years, the investigation has been briefly reopened in response to a tip, only to close again when it doesn't pan out. In 2006, while dying of cancer, Donald Forrester wrote letters to several people. One of them went to a person he named as an accomplice back in 1984 when he first confessed to the murders. Although the FBI redacted the letter, a cover sheet describing its contents suggests Forrester apologized for implicating his acquaintance. Later that year, Forrester died. It seems he went to his grave maintaining that at least some elements of his confession were false. Mel Wilsey, who took Forrester to the crime scene, and Virgil Vandegrift, the investigator with a knack for hypnosis, all think Forrester did it. They consider the case solved even though no charges were ever filed. Ken York, who worked with the Indiana State Police at the time, disagrees. He believes the crew of fast food robbers he found living in Franklin, Indiana were to blame. And Ken claims the so-called bearded man made a deathbed confession to his son, who reported it to police. The police sergeant who was in charge of the case from 1998 until 2018 also suspects a fast food burglary ring of 5 men. He won't say who they are, but based on his description, it's likely the same group Ken York thinks did it. These days, there's a new detective in charge of the case, Indiana Police Sergeant Bill Dalton. He took over in 2018 with big plans. In interviews, he talked about new advanced forms of DNA testing, as well as using AI to find patterns in old case files. Dalton even released new images of the knife used to kill Jane Freight in hopes of getting a fresh tip from the public. So far, his efforts have been fruitless, but Dalton isn't giving up yet. The most recent development in the case was a somewhat symbolic one. On March 21st, 2024, 46 years after the murders, the Burger Chef building was demolished. Although we can still hold out hope, it seems like we may never know for sure who killed Mark Flemons, Ruth Shelton, Jane Freight, and Daniel Davis. But if we can't give them justice, maybe the next best thing is is to remember them as more than just murder victims. At just 16, Mark Flemons was a loyal son and brother, a devout Jehovah's Witness, a musician, and a chivalrous friend. As an aspiring martial artist, he promised to always protect his sisters and the women he worked with. Ruth Shelton was a promising 17-year-old computer science student who balanced church choir practice with a packed schedule of AP STEM classes. Jane Freight was hard-working, practical, and ambitious. She was poised to become one of Burger Chef's youngest store managers, all before her 21st birthday. At just 16, Daniel Davis already knew he wanted to join the Air Force. His desire to serve his country was matched by his passion for aviation. The robber or robbers who broke into the Speedway Burger Chef that night in November 1978 took a few $100 from the registers, but they also stole something of infinitely greater value. Everything these four promising young people would have contributed to the world. Thanks so much for listening. I'm Carter Roy, and this is Murder True Crime Stories. Come back next week for the story of a new murder and all the people it affected. Murder True Crime Stories is a Crime House original. Here at Crime House, we want to thank each and every one of you for your support. If you like what you heard today, reach out on social media at Crime House on TikTok and Instagram. Don't forget to rate, review, and follow Murder True Crime Stories wherever you get your podcasts. And to enhance your listening experience, subscribe to Crime House Plus on Apple Podcasts. You'll get every episode of Murder True Crime Stories ad-free, along with early access to each thrilling two-part series and exciting bonus content. We'll be back next Tuesday. Murder True Crime Stories, a Crime House original, is executive produced by Max Cohen. This episode of Murder True Crime Stories was produced and directed by Ron Shapiro. Sound designed by Carrie Murphy. Written by Yelena War. Edited by Alex Benedon. Fact-checked by Claire Cronin. And included production assistance from Sarah Carroll. Murder True Crime Stories is hosted by Carter Roy. Want to stay grounded amidst the chaos of life? Introducing Mantra with Gemma Spey, a new podcast to help you clear your mind and stay centered. Mantra is an open mind original powered by Page Studios. New episodes drop every Monday. Just search Mantra wherever you listen to podcasts.
Purchase their territory, the government couldn't make them split it up if they didn't want to. In order for the Osage to allot their land, the U.S. had to negotiate with them.
And despite their resistance to allotment, the Osage knew they had to meet the government halfway. After all, they were well aware that the U.S. government was willing to resort to violence if they couldn't make a deal. So, the Osage Nation decided they were willing to allot the surface of their land, but they insisted on keeping their mineral rights in a collective trust.
Which was really, really smart of them. Most landowners never ever think about mineral rights at all, but maybe more of them should. If you own land, you almost certainly purchase the surface rights. That means you can do whatever you want above the ground, within reason, like build a house if you get a permit, or keep livestock if you follow zoning laws. But there's a good chance that you don't own the subsurface mineral rights. That means the right to exploit whatever resources are underground, like oil or gold. If you own the surface rights, but not the mineral rights, an oil company could just show up with a valid lease and notify you that they plan to drill on your property. Now, in some states, including Oklahoma, their right to drill would supersede your surface rights. Although
he ended up writing mineral rights into U.S. law for the very first time. Yep, more deposits from the Osage oil fields were producing over 5 is Crime House. If you knew there was a serial killer in your neighborhood, how far would you go to stop them? Would you gather evidence, call the authorities, and turn them in? Or would you get as far away as possible in hopes of saving your own life? That's a question the Osage people had to wrestle with when they discovered killers were lurking among them. But even as the authorities turned a blind eye to what was happening, the Osage people decided to stay and fight. Some sacrificed themselves for the greater good, while others worked in the background. And in the end, many of their killers were caught. But a century later, the question we're still asking is, was justice truly served? People's lives are like a story. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. But you don't always know which part you're on. Sometimes the final chapter arrives far too soon, and we don't always get to know the real ending. I'm Carter Roy, and this is Murder True Crime Stories, a Crime House original. Every Tuesday, I'll explore the story of a notorious murder or murders.
And I'm Nicole Lampin, host of Money Crimes. Just like in part 1, I'm joining Carter to shed some extra light on the financial aspects of the story.
Great to have you here again, Nicole. As always, at Crime House, we want to express our gratitude to you, our community, for making this possible. Please support us by rating, reviewing, and following Murder True Crime Stories wherever you get your podcasts. And to enhance your Murder True Crime Stories listening experience, subscribe to Crime House Plus on Apple Podcasts. You'll get every episode ad-free, and instead of having to wait for each episode of a 2-part series, you'll get access to both at once, plus exciting bonus content. This is the second of 2 special episodes in honor of National Native American Heritage Month. In the United States, Indigenous people go missing and are murdered at an alarming rate. This is especially true for Indigenous women. In 2016, it was reported that their murder rate is 10 times higher than the national average. At Crime House, we want to share and spread awareness about their stories, because everyone deserves justice. In these 2 special episodes, Nicole and I are doing a deep dive into the Osage murders, which took place in the Osage Nation in Oklahoma from 1910 to 1930. Last week, we explained how the Osage Nation came into incredible wealth when vast oil deposits were discovered on their land. But this attracted a wave of criminals who were desperate to get their hands on Osage money. Then, we introduced you to Molly Burkhart, an Osage woman whose family members died under suspicious circumstances, one by one. While we're focusing on Molly and her family in this 2-parter, we want to make it clear that the reign of terror reached far beyond this one household. It's likely that many Osage people in Oklahoma lost their lives, their land, their money, or all 3 at the hands of manipulative criminals. Today, in part 2, I'll share how some of these killers were finally brought to justice and what happened when Molly discovered who was coming after her family. All that and more coming up. Hey, it's Carter Roy, and if you love murder true crime stories, then I want to tell you about a brand new podcast I think you'll enjoy. Mantra with Gemma Spey. Every Monday, Gemma brings you a new mantra, a simple yet powerful phrase to help clear your mind and stay grounded amidst the chaos of life. She'll also share personal stories, journal prompts, and a weekly challenge to bring each mantra to life. Mantra is an open mind original powered by Page Studios. New episodes drop every Monday. Search Mantra wherever you listen to podcasts.
Oh, sheet. Honey chill. It's just laundry.
Not that. I'm talking about these Arm & Hammer power sheets. All the power of Arm & Sheet.
Most Osage citizens agreed on one very disturbing thing. They were being targeted and killed, all to get access to their wealth. There had been too many deaths and disappearances for the Osage to believe otherwise. It seemed like every member of the tribe knew someone who'd vanished or died under suspicious circumstances. Molly Burkhart, now 35 years old, knew at least 3. Her sister Minnie was the first to die after a mysterious illness. Her other sister Anna was murdered with a single gunshot. Their mother Lizzie died after experiencing the same symptoms as Minnie. Now Molly was starting to feel sick herself. As a diabetic, occasional periods of poor health were normal for her, but these new symptoms were different. Not to mention, there were widespread rumors of poisonings on the reservation. Rumors Molly must have heard herself. Molly was an intelligent, educated woman, and she knew she had something in common with the Osage people who had gone missing or died. They all owned head rights, shares the tribe's communally owned mineral rights. As of 1922, each head right was worth about $220,000 a year in today's money. Molly had her own head rights, but as more members of her family passed, she inherited theirs too. By the 1920s, Molly and her sister Rita each had 3, equaling $630,000 per year in today's money. Sisters married targets. Neither Molly nor Rita went to the local authorities for protection. That's because most Osage citizens rightfully believed the Oklahoma courts were on the killer's side. Local judges were the ones enforcing federal law by appointing white guardians to manage Osage money. That guardianship system was a major reason the Osage ended up in so much danger.
Around the turn of the 20th century, a federal law required all Osage people without white ancestry to have a so-called guardian manage their money. These guardians frequently abused their power to steal their ward's assets. They could use all kinds of financial mechanisms to do this, but the quickest option was to kill their ward and inherit their fortune, either by marrying them or becoming the next of kin or by partnering with a corrupt lawyer. To give you a sense of how big this business was, there were 400 professional guardians and lawyers in the town of Pahuska, the central Osage County town where Molly lived, which only had a population of a few hundred people, by the way. Now, we're mostly talking about the Osage Nation in this episode, but guardianship affected all indigenous tribes in Oklahoma.
The guardianship system was unjust for so many reasons, but since the Osage couldn't spend a dime without their guardian's approval, it made it harder to get themselves out of the situation. In 1922, Molly Burkhart was in this exact situation. Her husband, 30-year-old Ernest, served as her legal guardian. We don't know if Molly ever tried to move away from Pahuska or Osage County, but if she did, Ernest surely nixed the plan. Not to mention, Molly had 3 children to think about. By 1922, the couple had a newborn named after Molly's late sister, Anna, a 1-year-old son nicknamed Cowboy, and a 4-year-old called Elizabeth. With most of her family now dead, Molly didn't have much of a support system outside of her sister Rita and Molly's first husband, Henry. So Molly also leaned on the local Catholic priest. But after her family members started dying, Ernest wouldn't let Molly go to church, which was odd, but Molly didn't question him. For a long time, Molly believed Ernest genuinely had her best interests at heart. He was kind and caring, watching over her and their kids. Because of Molly's diabetes, she was often tired and in pain. Ernest helped administer her insulin injections and watched the children when she was too sick. He even did his best to learn Molly's indigenous language so she wouldn't have to speak English at home. So Molly wasn't wrong to think Ernest
Oh,
loved her
God,
and
okay.
wanted to protect her. But the truth was, Ernest was playing the long game. Molly knew Ernest spent a lot of time with his uncle, William King Hale. After moving to Osage County in 1902, William had become one of the most powerful men in the region. By this point, Molly had probably heard rumors that William was targeting Osage people for their head rights. What Molly didn't know was that William was using Ernest as a pawn too. He had been ever since William moved to Oklahoma. William even chose Molly as Ernest's wife and ordered him to propose. At first, Ernest obeyed his uncle out of respect, but now their relationship was based mostly on fear, or so it seemed. Ernest knew William was capable of just about anything. And it wasn't just Ernest who was scared of William, it was everyone. Not only was he one of the richest men in town, he was incredibly well connected. He counted everyone from sheriffs and politicians to mobsters and bootleggers among his closest friends. Back in 1922, nobody would dare cross him. That is, nobody except for Bill Smith. Bill was married to Rita, Molly's last living sister. He'd been part of their family for a while. In fact, before getting together with Rita, he'd been married to Molly's other sister, Minnie. It's hard to tell if Bill was a villain or a hero in this story. Some people suspected him of killing Minnie, largely because of how quickly he married Rita after she died. Bill also had a business relationship with William King Hale, and even claimed to have lent William a large sum of money, which wasn't reflecting well on Bill either. But on the other hand, Bill seemed truly terrified of losing Rita, not to mention his own life. He moved his family from the country to the biggest city in Osage County, hoping they'd be safer with more people around. There, Bill told anyone who would listen that his former wife, Minnie, and his mother-in-law had been murdered.
Yes. Oh,
He
that's
spoke
so
up
good.
in public meetings, demanding an investigation. In private, he told his friends that he believed William was involved. And this behavior put him at odds with many of his fellow white men, particularly those who benefited from what's become known as the Reign of Terror, including the lawyers specializing in native guardianship. Bill's message was getting so loud, people couldn't help but listen, even for the non-natives who, up until now, preferred to turn a blind eye. But then something happened that made all of the murders way too hard to ignore. In February 1922, a 29-year-old Osage man named William Stepson died suddenly in his bed. As a rodeo champion, he was physically fit and in excellent health. No one could believe he died overnight from a fatal illness. But now, with a local celebrity gone, many were determined to get to the bottom of it, which meant the truth was finally about to surface. Hey, it's Carter Roy here. And if you love murder true crime stories, then I want to tell you about a brand new podcast I think you'll enjoy. Mantra with Gemma Spade. Each Monday, Gemma shares personal stories, practical tips, and empowering mantras designed to help you stay grounded amid the episode-inspired growth and unlock your true potential. Mantra is an open-mind original powered by Page Studios. New episodes drop every Monday. Search Mantra wherever you listen to podcasts.
Jake Handel is the only man to survive a rare, incurable disease that destroyed his brain. For months, he lay motionless, silent, locked inside a coma. Everyone thought he was gone, brain dead. But he wasn't. He was fully conscious, and he heard everything. But Jake's story isn't just about a miraculous recovery. It's about a life shrouded in darkness. A world of heroin, secrets, and a deadly betrayal that cut close to home. Now, after years of silence and countless theories spun by journalists and online vigilantes, Jake is finally ready to tell his story. The real story. Uncensored. But telling it could be the most dangerous thing he's ever done. Blink. The true story of one man's survival and a mystery that leaves no one innocent. Coming February 2nd.
In February 1922, 29-year-old rodeo champion William Stepson was added to the long list of Osage headright holders who died under suspicious circumstances. After his death, a white man named Kelsey Morrison promptly married William's widow, putting himself in line to inherit the Stepson headrights. As was common with sudden, unexplained deaths of Native men, the old drink himself to death stereotype was brought forth. But this time, it didn't hold up. Everyone knew William Stepson, but wasn't living with any alcohol-related illnesses. And because he was well known as a rodeo star, there was a lot of attention around his death, which was why demand for an investigation being approved.
Oh my God.
In April 1922, Stepson's stomach was shipped to Oklahoma City for a coroner's inquest. His friends were certain that he died from strychnine poisoning, and no alcohol was found in Stepson's stomach. But the coroner didn't find poison either. However, Stepson had been dead for 2 months by then. Any traces of strychnine would have been long gone. It only takes 24 to 48 hours for the poison to disappear from the body. That didn't matter to the police, though. They declined to open a homicide investigation. Stepson's friends were outraged, and they became even more upset when his 24-year-old widow was found dead, too. Her death wasn't investigated as a murder either. And Kelsey Morrison, the white man who'd married her, inherited both of their headrights. It was getting harder and harder for anyone with a conscience to look away. Even some of the people who profited from the guardianship system were getting concerned. But the Osage were in an impossible position. Many of the people benefiting from the murders had close connections to law enforcement. William King Hale was a deputy sheriff himself, and local judges had no reason to step in. Their biggest concern was getting reelected, which wouldn't happen without the support of the area by naming them as guardians for the wealthiest Osage people around. With the system rigged against them, the Osage had no idea where to turn for help. Bill Smith did have an idea, though. Disgusted with the authorities' failure to act, he hired a private detective from Tulsa. We don't know his name, but we can assume he did his job well, because soon, Bill stopped implying that William King Hale was involved and started saying so explicitly. He told people he had enough evidence to prove William had killed Bill's sister-in-law, Anna Brown. He didn't go to the authorities with that evidence, but he suggested he might if the murders didn't stop soon. Molly Burkhart must have heard Bill's accusations, but she was concerned she was also being slowly poisoned. If she made any waves, she feared her death might come much sooner. And if that happened, she knew no one would be brave enough to investigate. It's difficult to overstate how powerful William King Hale was in Osage County at this time. He wasn't just a big fish in a small pond. He was a shark. He'd spent much of his adult life convincing the Osage he was their closest ally. He made big donations to local charities and provided expensive food for tribal events. He even offered cash rewards for information on murders, including Anna's, which Bill was now accusing him of planning. After each suspicious death, William made sure he was seen publicly comforting the bereaved, And because William owned a funeral home, he made sure all the victims were buried in top-of-the-line caskets, though it was at a substantial markup, paid for by the victims' estates. In between funerals, he showered his Osage friends with lavish gifts, ponies for the children, brand new suits for the men. He was happy to lend money to those in need, but when borrowers couldn't pay him back, they'd see a different side of William. Because as we know, William wasn't all kind smiles and free ponies. He frequently hired small-time crooks to do dirty work for him, including Kelsey Morrison, the man who married William Stepson's widow. And Kelsey was far from the only one. There were a lot of criminals living in or passing through Osage County at the time. William seemed to know most of them, from notorious interstate bootleggers to local petty thieves. Many ended up borrowing William Hale's money, then doing illegal favors for him to pay off their debts, like killing innocent people on his behalf. But Bill was on to him. With the help of the private detective from Tulsa, Bill figured out that William was specifically after Molly and Rita, and it wasn't hard for him to see the blueprints of William's plan. First, William would have Rita killed so Molly inherited the entire family's head rights. Then he'd have Ernest go after Molly, his own wife, so Ernest could inherit the head rights for himself, all before turning them over to William, with a massive payday for Ernest too, no doubt. But for all this to work, Rita had to be a widow when she died. Otherwise, Bill would inherit it all, which meant Bill would likely be William's next victim. But Bill wasn't the only person William was after. There were others standing in the way of his schemes, and they weren't all Osage. One of these people was a 55-year-old retired oil man named Barney McBride. The Osage liked Barney for the kindness and respect he showed the area's indigenous people. Sometime in 1922, a group of Osage people approached him about the murders happening all over their land. They knew their only hope for a real investigation was if a trusted white man went to the federal government. Barney agreed to take their concerns to Washington, D.C. He arrived on August 9th, 1922. When he checked into his hotel, a telegram was waiting for him with two menacing words: "Be careful." And he took that advice seriously. When he went out that night at a place called the Elks Club, Barney took both his Bible and his gun, but neither protected him. As he left the club, a group of men attacked him on the capital's dark, empty streets. They threw a bag over Barney's head and beat him viciously, crushing his skull. His body was found the next morning. He'd been stripped naked save for his socks and shoes, and stabbed more than 20 times. Clearly, someone was trying to send a message. Barney's 17-year-old stepdaughter was beside herself with grief. She hired private detectives and offered a large reward, but Barney's murder was never officially solved. The case drew national headlines, including one in the Washington Post that read, "Conspiracy believed to kill rich Indians." Although it cost him his life, Barney's mission was a partial success. By becoming the most prominent white victim of the Reign of Terror, he drew an unprecedented level of attention to the Osage murders. But more lives would be claimed before federal authorities finally stepped in. After 55-year-old Barney McBride was killed in August 1922, his murder drew national media attention to the Reign of Terror in Osage County. But the Osage people still weren't safe. In January 1923, tribe members Joe Greyhorse and Anna Sanford joined the long list of victims of Osage people killed for their head rights. It's not clear if William King Hale had anything to do with their deaths, but he certainly was involved with this next one. That January, 40-year-old Henry Roan, Molly Burkhart's first husband, wasn't doing well. His current wife cheated on him, and after Henry learned about it, his addiction to alcohol spiraled. William King Hale was aware of Henry's struggles, and he decided Henry would be the perfect next victim. But before William acted, he took out a $25,000 life insurance policy on Henry, worth almost $500,000 today.
Here's the thing, you can't just buy a life insurance policy on some random person, but you can do it for someone you have a so-called insurable interest in. In other words, someone whose death could really hurt you financially. Someone whose end of life could mean the end of your business, for example, as well. Usually that would be policy taken out on you.
Policy against him before forking over the cash, but it's also possible that Henry never consented at all, and William conspired with Henry's guardian to get the policy approved. Whatever the case, William was positioned to benefit from Henry's death, and he made his move one night in late January 1923. When Henry didn't come home that evening, his wife assumed he was out drinking, which he was, but William was banking on that part. He'd hired a bootlegger named John Ramsey to take Henry out on the town and give him free whiskey. Once Henry was good and drunk, William wanted John to shoot him and make it look like a suicide. John was halfway successful. On January 26, 1923, he shot and killed Henry. But the bullet entered through the back of Henry's head, which definitely didn't look like a suicide. John abandoned Henry's body in a car at the bottom of a stormwater channel and fled. Henry's body wasn't discovered until February 6th, when a couple of hunters stumbled across the crime scene. William grieved publicly for his supposed friend. He even insisted on serving as a pallbearer at Henry's funeral. Afterwards, he filed a claim under the $25,000 life insurance policy on Henry. Then, just for good measure, he started a rumor that Henry was killed by the man his wife was having an affair with. According to the bootlegger John Ramsey's later confession, Ernest Burkhart was in on this murder too, and his motive was an ugly one. Apparently, Ernest thought that Henry was going to divorce his wife and try to get back with Molly. For the moment, though, nobody knew who was responsible for killing Henry, but Bill Smith was certain he knew the answer, and he was threatening to go to the authorities about William, and this time it looked like he might actually do it. Bill had been holding on to his proof for months. Maybe he didn't want William to know what he had on him, or perhaps he thought William wouldn't dare actually kill him after he told everyone in town, "If I die, William Hale did it." But Bill also had a selfish motive for keeping his evidence to himself. See, William owed Bill $6,000. So instead of exposing the king of the Osage Hills, Bill tried to blackmail him into paying off the debt. That decision would end Bill's life and William's killing spree. On March 9th, 1923, 36-year-old Molly brought her 2-year-old son, Cowboy, to visit his Aunt Rita and Uncle Bill. Molly had planned to stay the night, but when they arrived, she found Bill and Rita in a state of panic. Dogs in their neighborhood were being poisoned. Bill and Rita took this to mean the killer, aka William, was sending them a message. Cowboy's presence was a welcome distraction, but he had a terrible ear infection, So Molly decided her son was too sick for a sleepover. She made her apologies and took Cowboy to the doctor before heading home. At 3 a.m. the next morning, as Molly was asleep in her own bed, a 5-gallon keg of nitroglycerin exploded under Rita and Bill's house. The blast was so loud, it shook Molly and Ernest awake on the other side of town. Ernest knew right away what had happened. After all, he was in on the whole plan. He knew William had hired another lowlife, someone named Asa Kirby, to plant the bomb. And he knew Molly was supposed to be there when it went off. Rita was killed instantly, as was her teenage house servant. Bill survived the blast, although his injuries were so bad he succumbed to them 2 days later. But he lived long enough for the family's head rights to be out of William's reach. Half of Rita's estate went to her half-sister, Grace Bighorn. The rest went to Bill, and when he died from his injuries, his share of the head rights went to his daughter in Arkansas. With his dying breath, Bill told the authorities his only enemies were William King Hale and William's nephews, Byron and Ernest Burkhart. This was the last straw for Osage tribal leadership. A few days after the bombing, they sent a full delegation to Washington, D.C. They lobbied the Department of the Interior, which oversees U.S. relations with Native tribes, for help. The Office of Indian Affairs finally agreed to their request. They formally asked the Bureau of Investigation, which later became the FBI, to investigate, as long as the Osage helped finance it. The Bureau put its assistant director, J. Edgar Hoover, on the case. Hoover dispatched an agent to Osage County on April 2nd, 1923, a little less than a month after the bombing. William King Hale was the Bureau's primary suspect from the beginning. Between Bill Smith's deathbed accusation and the life insurance policy taken out just weeks before Henry Roan's murder, it wasn't hard to make the connection. The problem was, William was so feared, nobody would say a word about him to a federal agent. With no one willing to come forward, the investigation stalled. But Hoover didn't drop it. In late 1924, the FBI was created and Hoover was appointed as the Bureau's first director. He passed the investigation on to the special agent in charge of Houston's field office, Tom White. In the summer of 1925, Agent White sent 4 undercover agents to investigate the Osage murders. Each was assigned a different persona: a doctor, a rancher, an oilman, and an insurance salesman. The last agent was particularly clever. Selling life insurance was a very effective way to find out who was afraid of dying. As the undercover agent went door to door, many of his customers said they believed William might kill them next. This gave the agent an idea. He decided to sell William a policy. And while William didn't go for it, he quickly befriended the agent. Before long, William was sharing a lot of personal information with him, including his plans to move to Florida on short notice. Of course, he had no idea he was spilling his guts to the FBI. Piece by piece, the agents built their case. They knew that if they wanted to put William away, they needed an army of witnesses to testify for the prosecution. In the fall of 1925, one critical informant came forward: Molly Burkhart's priest. He told the Bureau that Ernest was keeping Molly from attending services, but she'd gotten a message to him. She said she was afraid she was being poisoned. Thankfully, the priest's message reached the Bureau in time. Agents swooped in and rushed Molly to a hospital where her symptoms soon vanished. It turned out the medicine that was supposed to help her was actually killing her. Her insulin shots, which she got from 2 doctors on William's payroll, were full of poison. And it wasn't long until the investigators had all the evidence they needed. Just a couple of months later, in January 1926, 51-year-old William King Hale and his nephew, 33-year-old Ernest Burkhart, were finally arrested, as were many of their accomplices. William and the bootlegger John Ramsey were convicted of murdering Henry Roan. Both got life sentences. Kelsey Morrison was convicted of killing Anna Brown on William's orders and also received a life sentence. Ernest's brother, Byron Burkhart, who participated in Anna's murder too, avoided jail by testifying for the prosecution. Ernest was also sentenced to life in prison for his role in Bill and Rita's deaths. Molly filed for divorce. With Ernest and William in prison, Molly was free to go back to church and meet new people. She even fell in love again with a man named John Cobb. The couple got married in 1928, about 2 years after Ernest's trial. But this time, Molly was determined to do things differently. She sued to terminate her guardianship. In 1931, at the age of 44, she was declared a competent adult. For the first time in her adult life, Molly controlled her own fortune. She got to enjoy it for a few more years until she died in 1937 at the age of 50 after a long illness. Considering how many people had tried to kill her, living long enough to die of natural causes was its own kind of victory. So, was justice done? Criminally speaking, not really. William, John Ramsey, and Ernest were all ultimately paroled after serving just part of their life sentences. Kelsey Morrison's life sentence was repealed in 1931. 2 of William's hired guns dropped dead before they could testify against him. Most of the Osage murders remain officially unsolved. According to the Osage's current principal chief, Jeffrey Standing Bear, it's estimated that at least 5% of their tribe was murdered during the Reign of Terror years. In all likelihood, dozens of killers and accomplices were never charged.
Well, as for the financial side of things, the news is a little better here, although there's still work to be done. In 1925, a new law stopped non-Osage people from inheriting Osage head rights. Although the Great Depression ended the oil boom in Oklahoma, head rights continue to bring in a modest income for their owners and still do today. Beyond that, the Osage people were able to secure some additional financial restitution. After decades of watching the federal government mismanage their mineral rights trust, the Osage Nation filed suit in 2000. They claim the government failed to collect money owed to them for oil leases and also failed to invest that money for the benefit of head right holders. After years of legal wrangling, the government finally agreed to pay $380 million in damages. But that is just pennies on the dollar compared to what was stolen from the Osage people over the years. But it did help the tribe buy back some of their former land, starting with 43,000 acres purchased from multimedia billionaire Ted Turner.
The Osage Nation officially took ownership of that land in 2016. They're using it for farming and beef production with the goal of providing food security for the entire tribe. If they succeed, it'll be the first time in 200 years the Osage Nation can feed their population without relying on trade with the United States, proving just how resilient the Osage people are and why it's so important for us to remember the atrocities that were committed against them. Thanks so much for listening. I'm Carter Roy, and this is Murder True Crime Stories. Come back next week for the story of a new murder and all the people it affected.
And I'm Nicole Lapin. Every Thursday, you can tune into my show, Money Crimes, to hear about the world's most famous financial crimes and how to avoid becoming a victim yourself.
Murder. True Crime Stories is a Crime House original. Here at Crime House, we want to thank each and every one of you for your support. If you like what you heard today, reach out on social media at Crime House on TikTok and Instagram. Don't forget to rate, review, and follow Murder True Crime Stories wherever you get your podcasts. And to enhance your listening experience, subscribe to Crime House Plus on Apple Podcasts. You'll get every episode of Murder True Crime Stories ad-free, along with early access to each thrilling 2-part series and exciting bonus content. We'll be back next Tuesday. Murder True Crime Stories, a Crime House original, is executive produced by Max Cutler. This episode of Murder True Crime Stories was produced and directed by Ron Shapiro, written by Yelena War, edited by Natalie Pertsovsky, fact-checked by Beth Johnson, sound designed by Russell Nash, and included production assistance from Sarah Carroll. This episode of Murder True Crime Stories was hosted by Carter Roy and Nicole Lapin.
Coming to ABC and Hulu.
Amanda Riley was a mother, wife, speaker at her church, and then she got diagnosed with cancer.
A beloved young Christian woman fighting a battle undeserved.
We thought she was God's gift, but she was a liar.
Why would somebody fake cancer?
From the #1 smash hit podcast.
It was only a matter of time until Amanda's whole world came tumbling down.
You're not going to believe this. Scamanda. New episodes Thursday nights on ABC and stream on Hulu.
Want to stay grounded amidst the chaos of life? Introducing Mantra with Gemma Spey, a new podcast to help you clear your mind and stay centered. Mantra is an open mind original powered by Pave Studios. New episodes drop every Monday. Just search Mantra wherever you listen to podcasts. Operative. Now all Dorsey needed was a motive. And once again, the press was very helpful in providing one. By the time Leo was in custody, the newspapers were full of salacious rumors about him. Stories abounded about alleged affairs, a secret second family, a wife in Brooklyn that he'd murdered, and accusations that he was known to pull girls off of streetcars in attempts to grope them. This last story was seemingly confirmed when a teenage newsboy named George Epps told the prosecution that he knew Mary and had ridden a streetcar with her on the morning of her death. According to him, Mary was afraid of being alone with Leo. Epps claimed that Mary asked him to escort her home from work as often as he could so that Leo wouldn't harass her. This was the motive Dorsey was looking for. Leo was obsessed with Mary, and if he couldn't have her, nobody could. Now, they just had to make sure Jim Conley's testimony helped them prove it. At the end of May, detectives brought Conley in for a third round of questioning. Once again, his story changed. This time, Conley claimed not only was he forced to write the 2 notes found next to Mary, he had actually been at the factory the day she died. He had seen her body. He even carried it into the factory's basement. And it was all under direct orders from Leo Frank. That was all the grand jury needed to hear. On May 24th, 1913, they handed down their decision. Leo Frank would stand trial for the murder of Mary Fagan. Thanks so much for listening. I'm Carter Roy, and this is Murder True Crime Stories. Come back next week for part 2 of our series on the murder of Mary Fagan and the trial of Leo Frank. Murder True Crime Stories is a Crime House original. here at Crime House. We want to thank each and every one of you for your support. If you like what you heard today, reach out on social media at Crime House on TikTok and Instagram. Don't forget to rate, review, and follow Murder True Crime Stories wherever you get your podcasts. And to enhance your listening experience, subscribe to Crime House Plus on Apple Podcasts. You'll get every episode of Murder True Crime Stories ad-free, along with early access to each thrilling 2-part series and exciting bonus content. We'll be back next Tuesday. Murder True Crime Stories, a Crime House original, is executive produced by Max Cutler. This episode of Murder True Crime Stories was sound designed by Ron Shapiro, written by Greg Benson, edited by Alex Benedon, fact-checked by Catherine Barner, and included production assistance from Kristen Acevedo and Sarah Carroll. Murder True Crime Stories is hosted by Carter Roy. Looking for a deep dive into history's most notorious true crime cases? Check out Crime House True Crime Stories. Follow Crime House True Crime Stories now wherever you get your podcasts. And for ad-free listening and early access to episodes, subscribe to Crime House Plus on Apple Podcasts. This is Crime House. What drives someone to commit murder? Is it passion, desperation, or something darker deep down in the soul? These were questions that the people of Atlanta asked themselves following the murder of 13-year-old Mary Fagan. They wondered what possible reason a person could have to murder an innocent girl, and in such brutal fashion. But in the end, they didn't need a reason. All they wanted was to find someone to punish. Someone had to pay for such a heinous crime, even if it meant destroying the life of an innocent man. People's lives are like a story. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. But you don't always know which part you're on. Sometimes the final chapter arrives far too soon, and we don't always get to know the real ending. I'm Carter Roy, and this is Murder True Crime Stories, a Crime House original. Every Tuesday, I'll explore the story of a notorious murder or murders. At Crime House, we want to express our gratitude to you, our community, for making this possible. Please support us by rating, reviewing, and following Murder True Crime Stories wherever you get your podcasts. And to enhance your Murder True Crime Stories listening experience, subscribe to Crime House Plus on Apple Podcasts. You'll get every episode ad-free, and instead of having to wait for each episode of a 2-part series, you'll get access to both at once, plus exciting bonus content. This is the second and final episode on the 1913 murder of Mary Fagan, a 13-year-old girl who worked at a pencil factory in Atlanta, Georgia. After Mary was killed, her boss, Leo Frank, became the prime suspect, despite mountains of evidence that suggested he was innocent. Last week, we explored the circumstances around Mary's death, why the police decided to target Leo Frank, and how he was indicted on murder charges after a fierce media campaign against him. This week, we'll talk about Leo's trial, its immediate aftermath, and its tragic repercussions. Hey everyone, it's Carter. If you're loving Murder True Crime Stories, you won't want to miss our studio's new show, Crime House True Crime Stories. Every Monday, you'll go on an in-depth journey through 2 of the most notorious true crime cases from that week in history, all connected by a common theme, From notorious serial killers and mysterious disappearances to unsolved murders and more. Follow Crime House True Crime Stories now wherever you get your podcasts. And for ad-free listening and early access to episodes, subscribe to Crime House Plus on Apple Podcasts.
The process of accepting insurance outside of a group practice can be tough. But most people looking for mental health care want to use their benefits to pay for sessions. If you're interested in seeing clients through insurance, Alma can help. They make it easy to get credentialed with major insurance plans at enhanced reimbursement rates. They also handle all of the paperwork, from eligibility checks to claim submissions, and guarantee payment within 2 weeks. Plus, when you join Alma, you get access to time-saving tools for intake, scheduling, treatment plans, progress notes, and more in their included platform, so you can spend less time on it.
I messed it up. The cheese is supposed to be a slightly perfect square, but it's not. It's supposed to be on top, but I messed it up. It's okay, so. But I had fun making this. I'm going to turn off the live and eat. So, bye.